I am so excited to introduce Char Bah to you. Char Bah is actually a native Alexandrian, which I think is a really great part of this story, that she's from here, and then in many ways her work gives back to all of us. She grew up actually in the Parker Gray district, graduated from TC in 1975, and after that went on to UDC, where she double majored in urban studies as well as African American history. Even though she was doing her schoolwork, it's actually in that earlier period that she found her love and passion for genealogy and for history. So that was 38 years ago. I was trying to figure out the math. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's about right.
Okay. Math is not my forte, so that's why I was checking. She has demonstrated her passion for this through the many activities here in Alexandria and elsewhere in the region. First and foremost, she started her own business, FindingThingsforU, has given numerous workshops and lectures, has appeared on TV and in documentaries. She's volunteered an enormous amount of time for the city, particularly for Alexandria's Black History Museum, and of course, she's a published author. In 1997, Char began her journey towards her newest book, which is the basis of her talk tonight, Alexandria's Freedmen Cemeteries, A Legacy of Freedom. At first, she volunteered her time working with the Friends of the Freedmen Cemetery, and then around 2008, then city archaeologist Pam Cressy asked her to take on the task of finding the descendants of the individuals who are buried here at Freedmen Cemetery. And I believe, did you find 120 families?
No, we had 100, I said 171, but I think Fran has 150-something families.
All right, so we're gonna go in the mid-150s-ish to 170-ish, see numbers. And this is the basis of the talk. On top of all this, that's not her main job. In fact, Char actually worked for the federal government, had a long career there as well, but it's truly her passion for the stories of the individuals, families, and communities that are central to African American genealogy and history, and particularly here in Alexandria, a place that, even though she's not living here, I would say is her home. May we please all welcome Char Bah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming out today to hear me again talk about the Freedman Cemetery. This particular lecture is titled, They Came for Freedom. And in the process of researching to locate descendants, I was also able to tell you where they came from. When I asked the descendants, once I found them, I said, how long have people been in Alexandria? Talking to someone my age group in their 60s, their family had to be here at least for 4 generations for me to even know that they probably were here during the Civil War. Many of them said their family been here forever. Very few been here forever. So what happened is that many could not tell me any information beyond their grandparents. So what happened is that when I looked at researching and locating descendants, I went with the unusual names. Luckily, I was born in Alexandria, Virginia. I went to school with, here from elementary till I graduated from T.C. Williams. So I knew the African American community. I also knew the families, because back then you had to know everybody's mama, because you couldn't go over somebody's house unless your parents knew who the mama, the daddy was. So, so I kind of knew their parents. And many of them were still living when I started this project. I took the unusual names first. In any genealogical research, if you research and you got a family member that has an unusual name, count your blessings, because you will know, even if they got a common last name, you will be able to find them because of that unusual name. And it panned out to be true when I started looking for descendants. Last name Drayton is unusual to Alexandria. Draytons are normally, when I say Drayton, if I say Drayton in the African American community, chances are people are going to say South Carolina, especially if they're genealogists, because they had a large plantation down there owned by the Draytons, and they had lots of slaves. Alexandria, Draytons is out of place. And I thought that Drayton came from South Carolina, but that Drayton came from Massachusetts. I said, what you doing up here, coming down here? You know, so that was unusual. Then another unusual name in Alexandria, Shanklin, Shanklin, was two different sets of Shanklins. One that were freed African Americans in Alexandria prior to the Civil War. Another one came from King George County. I had to go by how they're naming their family to know which one was buried at the Freedman Cemetery. They're given names they gave their children every generation over. Then we also had people with the last name of some other unusual names. Franklin is not an unusual name, but it's an unusual name for African Americans in Alexandria. So what you might consider not an unusual surname, you have to look at the geographical location you're researching to find out whether it's unusual for it to be in this area. What I mean by unusual, meaning that if I find an African American last name Franklin, and it's not really a name that you normally see in Alexandria, when you see another Franklin, it's a possibility they are related. It's a possibility that that family came from them. And that proved that these Franklins were in Alexandria as far back as the 1700s, and they were freed African Americans, and they buried at the Freedman Cemetery. I used different type of methods in genealogy. Years of doing genealogy, I've been doing it for over almost 40 years. And what happened is that I developed my own way. And doing it after learning somebody else's way, then I had to change things, because when you research in ethnic groups, don't care whether you are African American, you're Irish, you're Italian, you're going to end up doing it in a unique way because of that particular ethnic group requires that type of research. So what happened is that I came up with my own method. It took me about 2 to 3 days to confirm whether this person connected to the Freedman Cemetery. It was almost like driving up to McDonald's and ordering food. Oh, I got it, and then driving off, and that's how I was operating. Working a full-time job, getting home at 6, start researching from 7 to midnight, get up at 3:15, get ready for work, be on the bus before 5 to take me to DC to go to work. And I did that for the entire time I was doing the research on the Freedman Cemetery from 2008 to 2014. And I retired in 2014. So here we go. How did they come here to Alexandria? Many came by wagon, some came by river, some came on foot. And how do we know this? Well, one of the eyewitnesses to the Civil War is the newspaper. I read over 2,000 newspapers to get a feel of what was going on in Alexandria, and there's a whole lot more out there besides what I read. And they were talking about how people were coming in on foot. When I was researching and locating people, I knew, like, the Chisley family is another unusual name. The Chisley family came from Maryland into Alexandria for their freedom. The Chisley family probably came by boat. The Chisley family, their slave owner was bringing them to Alexandria to go to St. Mary because he was Catholic. And so they were familiar with the area. So when the chance came for them to have their freedom, they made it. And many of them took their master's boats and came right across the Potomac, and they were here. The Chisley family, they buried at the Freedman Cemetery. It appears they might have been, after the Civil War, had their remains reinterred at St. Mary's Cemetery. When you do research, sometimes knowing more about the people and what's going on tells you the story. The only thing you have to do is look for the documentation to support the story. I couldn't understand that Chisleys were here and now they're over in St. Mary. When I started looking at their early marriages, because quite a few people came, they wanted to be legally married. Even if they were married to their spouse in the slave way, as soon as they were able to marry legally, they got married. So I looked at vital statistic records and by the statistics records told me where they came from. Some came by train. Another family that I located came from Frederick, Virginia by train. They were free blacks and got their freedom in 1851. They were owned by their own father, who was an African-American slave owner. He purchased his family, but he never freed them. He dies in 1850, around 1852 or 1853, he dies. He had in his will that his sons should be emancipated, but he did not say anything for his daughters. They would have been sold if it wasn't for his brother, who lived in Washington, D.C., who was executive of his will. He came and he freed them all. They came to Alexandria because they had a relative in Alexandria that worked for the Hoe family. Bernard Hoe, if I'm correct, was the first mayor of Alexandria. Bernard Hoe was from Prince William County. He had domestic slaves in his household. And the Lucy and Louise Robinson, who came to Alexandria on the train, came because their sister, Hester Robinson, was working for the Hoe family. And we believe she was a slave. We believe they had different mothers, and one was in slavery and the other one. And so when they came, Lucy was able to work for the Hoe family. Louise kind of disappeared off the radar. I don't know exactly where she went. And they worked for the Hoe family. And when Mary D. Hoe, D-A-D-E, Hoe, died, her husband died in 1864. When she died, she left Lucy. Hester was the child. Leanna was Hester's mom. She left them $1,000, and I was able to obtain her will along with her mentioning they were her faithful servants. A child was buried at the Freedman Cemetery, Leanna Robinson. That was Lucy's child that she named after her sister, Leanna. And they the ones who came from Frederick, Virginia. Here is a newspaper clipping of the refugees continue to arrive from the south. This is coming into Alexandria, and it tells you that some of them came in on the train. This is an old map of Alexandria, and this is the most recent map. Some of the articles stated that the contrabands, once they got to Alexandria, they were called contrabands, that they actually came down King Street. So if they came down King Street, they marched down King Street, it gives me an idea they probably came in by river. It's clues left, you just have to look outside the box and realize that it's telling you a story. So here's the waterfront here and here. And I have a newspaper article saying they were marching down King Street. So when I was researching some of the, looking for some of the descendants, and I was researching their ancestor, I saw quite a few people who came from Charles County, Maryland. St. Mary, Maryland. I don't believe they came by land. I believe they were the ones who were probably marching down King Street from the Potomac River. Another article, say a long line of refugees from, and they call them foreigners too, among them a number of women and children from the South who have recently come within the federal lines, passed down King Street. And you will see some of them say they came in from Fairfax County. And I believe they might have been walking. And then some will say they came by train. So that's how I knew how some of them came to Alexandria. Again, looking at the map, reading the articles, trying to visualize how these people might have come into Alexandria. I put this map here for a reason, because as I was researching and finding where they came from, a large amount of the people came from Fauquier County, the ones that I located. And Fauquier County, where is Fauquier? It's up here someplace. Okay, Falker, Prince William, Culpeper, Orange, a little from Spotsylvania, quite a few from Stafford, and King George. The Shanklins were from King George. And a lot came from this region, and the other group came out of St. Mary, Prince George's, and Charles County. For everyone that I was researching, I actually would get their vital statistics. And if you know anything about oh shoot, what did I do? Okay, I didn't cuss. So anyway, I would get I would go after vital statistics first. I got this person who's deceased, buried at the cemetery, last name is not what I would consider a known name in Alexandria. Then I would look for deaths records. I would see how long they've been in Alexandria. And when you get in vital statistics, that would tell you that, because every time you get vital statistics, it would ask on there, where were they born? And many times it would have where. And if you know they were born, this person was born in Haymarket. And this person died in 1836. And you subtract 46, to get around the time they were born. Now, somebody else is giving that information. In genealogy, we consider this only primary source on this document is that this individual is dead. We know that, so that's primary source. We know what he died of, because mostly signed by the doctor. And we know the date. That's primary source. All the rest of the information is considered secondary source. Even to the point he was buried at the cemetery. Suppose something happened along the way, he get buried someplace else. And I have a case like that on a reverend who's supposed to be buried someplace else, but he was buried at another cemetery. But it said on his death certificate he was buried someplace else. So the informant is given this information here. The informant is asked those questions. They might or might not know the information. They give the information, but they might not really know. So this is the part you constantly have to find other documentation to prove this right or wrong. Anyway, I found Sylvester Roy. This name has been passed down in the family so many times that today they have a Sylvester Roy living in Oxon Hill, Maryland, that connects to the Freedman Cemetery, whose family came from Alexandria. Keeping up with the names, the naming pattern, how people name their children. You see a pattern from year to year, from generation to generation, and you want to pay attention to that because that helps you. Also, I know the location of where these people were living in Alexandria. The Roys came out of the seminary area. The Roys are associated with Mead's Church, and prior to Mead's Church, because Mead's Church did not come around until 1870s, I think. And prior to Mead's Church, they were probably attending Christ Church. For every African American church is a mother church out there. Mother is, if they've been in that era long enough, it's going to be a white church, because the slave owners took their slaves to church. And when you know that and know what church it is, it's easy for you to find who owned them. Because where African American records, especially Baptists, are very weak, non-existent for many, because many people were illiterate and did not record things, it's going to be the mother church that recorded them, going to church with the master. Though I'm working on the Freedman Cemetery, I'm looking for descendants, and one must stay grounded on that. So if you're looking for descendants, why should I be hanging out at another cemetery? This is Bethel Cemetery. Well, when people were buried at the Freedman Cemetery, their family buried them. Their family one day died too. Where did they get buried? They mostly buried at Bethel Cemetery. It was Bethel, the cemetery was important. Why was it important? Do you think, why would I hang out at Bethel when I'm researching people for Freedmen? Have any clue? I love cemeteries. Okay, so when I went to the cemetery and I saw the Roy here, I looked for the date of death, which is is found in the, I think on here was like 1980s or something. But look at the flowers. They tell you somebody is coming. I got me a descendant. Now I just have to find out who. And so that's why I go to cemeteries. I'm looking for somebody, I find where the cemetery is, of their family or whatever, and I look. And if it's maintained, flowers there, I've seen, you know, even birthday balloons and stuff like that. I laminate my business card. I leave it at the headstone, and I usually get a call several months later. Okay? Cemeteries tells no lies, and I'll do a whole lecture on that. You know they're there, right? Okay. Another thing in finding descendants, you must know the history of the area you're researching. I had to know the history of the white churches as well as the black churches, because prior to the Civil War, black people were attending white churches with their masters. Normally, when I'm doing that research, I look for all of the churches that were existing before 1865. And usually, many of the slaves, after they got their freedom, actually stayed in the same religion for at least the first decade or so. Some later went into Baptist, but if they were Methodist, they stayed in the Methodist church. If it was not a black Methodist church after the Civil War, what they did, they went to a Baptist church, and then later on, the community would build their own Methodist church. Those are clues for you to find descendants. So that's why I put the year here. I actually take pictures of things like this, and I post it all over the house. My house is a mess. And I post them so I can stay grounded. Okay, Christ Episcopal Church. Out of Christ came Meade's Church. So the early people of Meade's Church had to have been members at Christ's Church. And that's how my mind works. St. Mary's Catholic Church, 1795. St. Joseph didn't start until 1915. All those years, if they were Catholic, they were probably attending St. Mary's Catholic Church. Trinity Church, Roberts Memorial United Methodist Church, first called Roberts Chapel, came out of Trinity United Methodist Church. They started in 1832. Freed blacks and slaves attended this church. Their records go back prior to the Civil War, and they have their own records in their own church. Some of the descendants have, and to this day, family has been attending the same church, for 150 years. No, oh, here I go again, sorry. Knowing the families, Miss Lillian Stanton Patterson is a long employee of the city, works at retired to come back and help out at the Black History Museum. Her family, she connects through the Carey family. Her grandmother was a Carey, and they helped start that church. The Nortons, also, their family, they connect to the cemetery named Henry and Sarah. They were in Alexandria during the Civil War, living in the slave pen. They are also early members of Shiloh. Third Baptist. These are descendants that connect to Third Baptist Church. Judy Coles Bailey, her ancestor migrated from Prince William County, came into Alexandria, and when I did the research, come to find out, they had relatives already here during the Civil War, and they will end up living next door to them. I also do research on everybody that lives in the neighborhood. If that person is in that neighborhood, I can tell you about everybody that lives in that neighborhood. Because what happened is that they can be their in-laws, they can be their siblings. And unfortunately, when people were enslaved, not everybody's siblings came out with the same surname. So you must be aware when you're researching enslaved people. Their brother his surname might be different from his sister's surname, or his mother's surname might be different, his father's surname might be different, because people were selling and buying and breaking up families, and they had different owners. And when they got their freedom, they might decide to all use the same surname. Sometimes they got confused. I have, in my own family, 1870, they were called using one surname. By 1880, they decided to change it to another surname. And so it can get very difficult, but knowing the culture, knowing what's going on can help you get through all of that. The Taylor family, when I talked to them, Miss Dorothy Taylor was living at that time, and she was in her late 80s when I interviewed her. And she said her family had been here forever. Not quite forever. When I did the research on her family was kind of unique. Her sons are Donald Taylor, John Taylor. Miss Dorothy Napper Taylor was the one I interviewed. Her family really came here from Caroline County. Her great-grandfather, his story is different. He fled during the Civil War. He fled Caroline County and went to Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia area. When he got there, it was overcrowded. And so Butler, who managed the fort, got permission to ask any of the slaves, had to be based on volunteer, do you want to go to Haiti? We are having a ship to take you to Haiti, and you'll have your own land, you'll be able to have your own house and everything. They promised him the world. He was one of the ones who signed up to go, along with 500 others. They get to Haiti, and it's no bed of roses. The land is different. They don't know how to work the land. They can't do the kind of crops they were used to. And they started complaining, and they were not immune to mosquitoes. They were dying. They were getting malaria. They started complaining. The word get back to Butler. Butler gets to the president, and they said, bring them back. But what they do, they don't bring them to Fort Monroe. They drop them off in Alexandria, Virginia. And Miss Dorothy's great-grandfather met her great-grandmother, and they married. And their last name's Washington. And she thought they'd been here forever. And so that's her story. Judy Coles Bailey she has an interesting story. Her family comes in from Prince William County here, and they already got relatives, the last name Nash. Her ancestor last name was Harris, and she comes here with her two daughters. Her name was Mary Harris. She meets a man, last name Hodge. They get married, and he's a little bit of a ladies' man. He dies of syphilis. She puts down that, before he died, she put down that she was a widow before he even died. So I guess when she found out that he had that, so when she dies, her daughter, Rosa, ends up marrying twice. Her first husband last name is Jackson, and her second husband last name is Armstead. She's an early member of Third Baptist Church. From Third Baptist Church, their second minister is Phil's Cook, and I could go into Phil's Cook. He's a very interesting man. Phil's Cook believed that women could be ministers and deaconess, and at that time it was unheard of. And he felt he got a lot of opposition from the church, so he starts a church called the Little Red Church, which ends up being Ebenezer Church. And Rosa follows him. And he makes her a deaconess. So they have the first deaconess in their family came from Rosa, and she was at Ebenezer. But what's unusual about Rosa is that she names a daughter after herself named Rosa. And that Rosa migrates to New York and meet a man last name Lawrence. It's Lawrence, yeah, Armstead. Armstead, yeah, Lawrence. And Rosa is from her second marriage to a man named Armstead. So her daughter Rosa has a son who became very famous during the Harlem Renaissance period as a famous painter named Jacob Lawrence. They have Alexandria roots. And so among some of the descendants, their families went on to become famous in different ways. And so the niece that I connect to, Judy, is his Jacob Lawrence's niece. When she got married, he gave her away because her father was deceased. And she lived in New York when I interviewed her. I located her in New York. And then after coming back to Alexandria and stuff, she decided to move to a retirement area in Fredericksburg, and that's where she lives now today. This is Miss Dorothy. Strolling through the cemetery, again, finding her, because I see at the grave of her mother, that's her mother, 1898. Yeah, is flowers there. I knew it had to be a descendant not too far away. Roberts Memorial United Methodist Church. Miss Carolyn Phillips McCrae did not know the rich history that her family had. On her mother's side, they were never slaves, and she had no idea. It was never passed down. Her people were freed people in Alexandria, documented all the way back to the 1700s. When you were a freed African American, and I try not to use the word Negro or enslaved because it's sensitive to some people, so you know what I mean, right? You had to register as a freed person. You had to take your freed papers on you. Luckily you did, because I can see those records today. Without that, I would not be able to tell that story, because the law required them to have the register every 2 to 3 years as freed people to say how they got their freedom. They got new papers. I was able to tell her her story. She descends from the Middleton family, Middleton. Well, her father dies and her mother has to work to take care of her. And back then, and she was born in, Miss Carolyn was born in 1938. Many African Americans who had to go, the women who had to go out and work, and they were widows or single mothers, they left their children at a babysitter and picked the child up on the weekend. So that child was with the sitter from Monday through Saturday morning. Well, Miss Carolyn's sitter was in her 80s, and Miss Carolyn's mother didn't quite come back to get her. So she grew up calling her babysitter her mom. And her babysitter also kept another child, last name Middleton, but it was spelled incorrectly, Milton instead of Middleton. He also was left there, and his mother didn't come back to pick him up. They grew up like brothers and sisters. They were first cousins, but did not know it until I told her when I did the research. Miss Carolyn always attended Roberts Memorial. At that time, I think it was called Roberts Chapel, and it changed the name. When I started doing the research, and she asked me to, I didn't do it as knowing that she was connected, and then in the process, found out that she connects to the cemetery. Miss Carolyn's family been in that church for over 200 years and did not know. The records at that church had her people in it, and she did not know. And so she has over 200 years of history in Roberts Church, and probably another so many years at Trinity. Frances Norton Burton, they connect to Shiloh on her father's side, and they connect to Roberts on her mother's side. The Robertsons were there. For every family in Alexandria that I have researched, I can tell you what church they came out of. I can tell you what their people, how the people were associated with the church. I can tell you where they buried. I can tell you where they migrated to. And Shireen Hampton Bell, she is a Franklin. Her family were also freed African Americans in Alexandria came very large landowners, and they bought up a lot of land in Alexandria. Shireen lives in Philadelphia. She called me to ask me to help her do some research, and she was telling me about her family, and I said, your family connects to the Freedman Cemetery, because I already connected Miss Carolyn, who also is related to the Franklin. The Militant and the Franklin married each other, and when I told her, within 24 hours, she was in Alexandria. She got hotel, came straight, and I took her to the cemetery and showed her her great-grandfather's headstone that is very tall, with all the names of her relatives on it. The old site of Alfred Street Baptist Church, it was called the Colored Baptist Society. If you do not know the original name of a place or a church, when you're researching, you will never find a deed. And so you have to know some history about the church. Churches are getting less and less into the history of their church online. I don't know why, but in most cases, I'm finding they're glorifying the present pastor and not giving enough information on the church history. So if that's the case, you would never know that that church was called Colored Baptist Society. And that's what you're going to have to research first if you want to find out where the people during the Civil War was attending church and if they were attending that church. Dana Banks, second one on this list, come from a long line of family members who were entrepreneurs. To this day, their families are entrepreneurs. Dana owned about 6 beauty shops throughout Woodbridge and Dumfries. Her family, her grandfather was well known for Olin. They called him the junk man, but basically when he died, he was a millionaire, and he turned over his property to Fairfax County, and it's a park today. He did not want his kids to split it up, and so what he did, he sold it to Fairfax County for under the cost, and it's a beautiful place. Harry Burks, the Burks go all the way back. Now, by their last name, you'll think they might be associated with Burke and Herbert, but the descendants, the ancestors of Burke and Herbert were the executors on Fitzhugh probate package. And maybe they thought when they got their freedom, it was Silas Burt who gave it to them, but it was mentioned in Fitzhugh's will that he emancipates his slaves. The Burts are emancipated in the 1850s, and they register as free blacks, and that's how I was able to document them. Some of them stayed in Prince William County because the Fitzhughs own a massive property in Fairfax County, Prince William County, all the way to Stafford County, they own property. So the ones who were on the Prince William County plantation, they stayed in Prince William County. The ones that were on Fairfax plantation came to Alexandria. And today, Mr. Harry Burke he had many strokes. He was very active in the Black History Museum. He was one of the ones who got the Black History Museum to where it was, where it is today. And he is a member of Alfred Street Baptist Church. So when I saw the Burke name, I knew it very well, and I knew to go to Alfred Street because I knew they were associated with Alfred Street Baptist Church. Quandas. I don't have to say much about them, do I? Interesting. Way back, I want to say maybe 30 years ago, I was doing some research at the National Archives, and I came across Armfield and Franklin's ledger of their cargo they were selling. They purchased slaves, put them there, and then they sold them, put them on a boat, and sold them. And that's the first time I saw the Quanda name, because it was a Quanda that was on their boat to be sold. And I always wonder how come, because they were emancipated, from George Washington's plantation. Anyway, the Quandas have a whole little section, the Quandas, and it was a Quanda that was buried at the Freedman Cemetery. So I didn't have to look far. I knew exactly where to go when I saw the Quanda's name. And you can see here's Henry Quanda, 1848. Well, it's really, I don't know which one is which because it's Amanda is also, Amanda probably is Amanda, and dies, no, one was born in 1848 and another one died, well, it almost looked like 1818, but it's probably 1918. Bethel is the home it's the burying site for most of the people who were buried at the Freedman Cemetery. There are families who buried them at Freedman Cemetery. When they died, many of them were buried at Bethel. So those two cemeteries, hand in hand, and looking for descendants, looking for possible signs that somebody keeping the grave clean, somebody left some flowers. I went on one headstone I found where the person had a happy birthday balloon tied to their headstone. The person died in 1928. And somebody in the family, I guess it's passed down generations to make sure they go and, celebrate their birthday, I guess. Here is the monarchy, and usually when you're going through vital statistics and you suspect you got migration, you're going to have to go all the way back. So first you're going to check out, you're going to have a suspect. I always say look for a suspect, somebody with the same name, living in the same area, and then work through the vital statistics. And by doing that, I worked from generation to generation back. I went back and forth. I did from the past to the present, from the present to the back, until I was able to narrow it down. In this particular case, Fairfax Jackson, interesting, his son became a lawyer in Alexandria. And some of them did remarkable things, 10 years, 15 years after slavery, they were on the ball. And so looking for descendants. And then I get into his, he marries into the monarchy. I stayed away from Jackson, Jones, Smiths, and all those type of names because I'll be still doing that. I went after him because of the monarchy name. And was able, then once I found the monarchy name, then I was able to narrow it down. And you can see they came out of Caroline County. So they came here for freedom, and they came from all various places, but they came into Alexandria. Also, interesting things came out of the research. Paul E. Piper, he ended up being, I guess, early doctor, African American of mixed race. Whereas their names are not even talked about. Many people don't know that, When I get death certificates, I pick it like a bone, like a chicken bone. You get all the meat, don't leave nothing. That's how I do a death certificate, or all vital statistics, because they mean something. We can see that he was married when he died. He was still married. He was not a widow. Christine Jackson was around. I go researching Christine Jackson, get her death certificate, get their marriage license, find out what happened to her. See here, he's a lawyer. I started going through city directories to see where he practices law in the City of Alexandria. Here it says he was born in Alexandria. And his father was Fairfax Jackson Sr. His mother's maiden name was Montague. Though it said it's had Virginia, but over here, when I go, I see that her brother was born in Caroline County. I go to the census and see her before she marries to see what family she's in. I get down here to see who was the informant. And here it looked like it says sister, but here, unless the sister was named after the mother, and continue to look at everything, cause of death. I keep up with cause of death, especially when I'm doing family research, because I can tell a person before the doctor tell you what you might likely die of. And I got, personally, in my own family, I got over 700 and something death certificates, because when somebody dies, I cry with one eye and I'm asking the undertaker, I need that death certificate, you know. So, here's the Lightfoot family. Now, Amy Birch, if you know Amy Birch, she worked for OHAR. She worked on the cemetery project before I got it, and she found one family, and that was the James Lightfoot. One of the most things that people don't think about when you're doing research, and I guess you would call it social history, okay, is that you have to involve the people that you're researching. Otherwise, you're not going to get the stories. I can get all the documents that I showed you, but you don't have the stories without the people. Not all the stories are going to be true. They can be, elaborate, whatever, but you won't get the stories. And so when you're doing that type of research, you want to bond with that community. As an African American, I can tell you it's not easy tracing African Americans. As an African American, I can tell you if you don't bond with it, I don't care what race you're from, you're not going to get anything out of them. I was born in Alexandria. When I got ready to do this research, nobody would talk to me. My maiden name is McCargo. They said, we don't know the McCargos. You sure you're a home girl? I said, yes, I am. I don't know the McCargos. They wouldn't talk to me. I had to go to my classmates and talk to their parents. Can you talk to so-and-so to tell them that you know my family? Otherwise, they would not talk to me. And so that's how. So just because I'm African American is not easy. It's just the way people are. They're more suspicious and whatever. And for many African Americans in Alexandria, it's a problem with the land. For so many, in their history, they have gone through, eminent domain or urban renewal, and they just feel anybody knocking on their door. I made a mistake with Mrs. Chisley. She was one of the early ones I wanted to talk to, and she's 100 and something years old now. And I called her up on the phone and I said, I work for the city. Bang. I said, call back. And then she got on, and then she answered the phone with a child's voice. Hello. I said, can I speak to Mrs. Chisley? No, she's not. I don't know who, you got the wrong number. I never did get an interview with her. My mistake is that she thought the city was trying to take her house, and she would not talk to anyone if you said you would work for the city. So I didn't get that interview, and she was one of the early African Americans that were a stenographer for Fairfax Jackson. And I wanted that story so much, but now I think she has dementia. Fielding Gaines. I found 4 different families that connect to him. Fielding Gaines, I found some of his grandkids and their siblings split, and they all went different ways. I found each one of his grandkids, where they went, and I found descendants. Fielding Gaines owned property on West Street, and a deed to his house of 1870. One of his descendants has that deed to his house that he owned on West Street. Fielding Gaines' mother was named Martha. The person who actually buried him did not know that, and she died. Her husband died first, and she died later. She was not buried at Bethel. Was that Black Heritage Park? She's one of the ones who were buried there, and luckily for me, she has a headstone, and that is Fielding's mom. And that told me something. It told me that she went to Shiloh, because the people who were buried there, many of them were members of Shiloh. And knowing the history is important to be able to do the genealogy. One of his descendants live in Baltimore. She retired about 10 years ago as a principal. Another one owns her own IT business and lives in DC. Another one is in Philadelphia, I found. and she is a medical doctor, and none of them knew each other. None of them knew each other. And they all came to the first dedication of the Freedman Cemetery. The one in DC inherited the family Bible from her grandmother. And these are some of his descendants. The Diggs family. And the interesting thing about the Diggs family, they also connect to many families, but they came out of Prince William County, and they connect to Seminary. They're up at Seminary. Since I took this picture, he's deceased and she's still living. And they also connect to the Scott's family that are buried at the cemetery. They had her best friend at Parker Gray. Oh, excuse me, go back. Her best friend at Parker Gray, unknown to her, was her second cousin. And I was able, when I did research on her, I was researching this other woman. I said, wait a minute, some of this stuff sounds familiar. Wait a minute. And so I go back and I said, do you know this Diggs woman? She said, yeah, we're best friends. I said, do you know y'all related? She said, get out of here. I said, yes, you are. I said, see, I just gave you something free. You didn't have to take a DNA. So Haskins, I went to school with Haskins. So as soon as I saw that some Haskins were buried at the Freedman Cemetery, I knew there had to be those Haskins. There was no other Haskins in Alexandria. Plus, I have the graduating class from 1920 for every year until Parker Gray closed in 1965. I have the graduating class names of everyone. So that helped me a lot too, to see the names and go back and look. Anyway, I went to school with the Haskins. When I started talking to them, I said, how long you all been in Alexandria? Forever. Well, they came from Petersburg, Virginia, during the Civil War to Alexandria. And they settled in the area that we know as the Birds, which is the official name, is Petersburg. Wanzas. When I say Wanzas, most people know you don't have to go far. The Wanzas are from Seminary. The Wanzas were living on King Street during the Civil War, and they buried at the Freedman Cemetery. That was easy because that's such an unusual name. And they are still up in that community. Wallace Wanza was the one, and Wallace came from Fauquier County, and he was a craftsman. He shoed horses. He also was a carpenter, and so he was a very skilled person. Now, I have what I call my elderly people that I talk to. I talk to about, from Alexandria, I talk to about close to 60 to 80 people a month from Alexandria, especially my older people. And so one of them, her grandmother died before she was born. Her grandfather remarried, and he married a woman with the last name Hackley. And so I was going over some names with her, and she said, Char, I know my step-grandmother talked about her mother named Martha. I said, really? And we have a Martha that was buried there. Now, she's 86 years old herself. So I said, I know the naming, usually many African Americans repeat names generation to generation, given names. So I looked into this, and based on her step-grandmother's age, her mother would have been born prior to the Civil War. And then we have up here, we have this Hackley named Gabriel Hackley, and he was age 50 when he died. It also gives you the streets, so you know exactly where they were located. So, Miss Norma, my elderly friend, this is her mother, and this is her father. And her mother dies at the age of 74. her mother's first name is Esther, and her father is Jesse Speaks, and her mother is Georgia Lewis. Jesse marries a second time. Okay, so over here is, where am I? What I'm looking at, okay. When, I gotta get over here, look. Okay, so when she dies, her parents are mentioned. And that's why you can go generation to generation. So when Maddie, this is her step-grandmother, when she dies, I get the death certificate to see who her parents are. And she mentioned a James Hackley and her mother named Martha. To confirm is that Martha. Okay, then I go after, this is Maddie Speaks, who's the one who died, James Hadley, and then Martha. James died. I went back to her father's one, James Hackley, and look at whose daddy is, Gabriel. Gabriel is the one who buried at the Freedman Cemetery. Not all of them are that easy. You just have to keep using certain things. And Maddie was the one who buried, who you just saw her death certificate, and she is the step-grandmother to Mrs. Norma, who told her about her mother, Martha. They were from Culpeper, and he was a carpenter. Okay. Shanklin family, and they come out of King George, Virginia. The Shanklins did not know they came from King George. Only history they remember in their family, they were once in D.C., so they thought they came from D.C. But during the Civil War, everything was crowding up, so when Alexandria got too crowded to take in any more people, they would go to Washington, D.C., to the Freedmen's camps over there, or barracks, and see can they get room, or then they come back, or they go somewhere else. But they didn't go far because they did not want to be outside of the Union territory. Thanks. Thank you.
Does the audience have any questions for Char?
I'd like to know how you've kept track of all your data. You have 5x7 cards, or are you in the computer database? What do you do?
Basically, I use this Microsoft. The genies would love for me to promote family tree software and stuff like that, but I crashed several times on my own research, and I was about to crash and try to figure out getting all that information. So basically, I had everything indexed by family surnames. So if I have, like Miss Norma, there was the Speaks family and the Hackley. And in there, I would have, I wrote it up in narrative format, taking the information off the primary documents. So that's how I kept up with it. I want to read a passage to you. What I did with the book, if you're not related to somebody, the last thing you want to read is somebody else's genealogy, right? I wanted to make it such a way that people would feel what I felt. I dealt with a lot of spirits in this research. I would feel like hot things passing me and you know, stuff like that. And I'm not a person that easily get jinxed. If I did, I wouldn't be hanging out at the cemetery. And so at that time, my mother passed this February, because she was my traveling partner. And she didn't like cemeteries, so she'll tell me, you go ahead, I'll stay in the car. And she said, I'll keep it running too. So one incident, I'm at the cemetery and it's late. And by the time I get so involved and forget that, you know, I lose track of time. And it started getting dark. But I got back up, I got my flashlight. And Mama in the car, she said, we better get out of here. So get into the car, and the car stalled. And when I started it, it was like somebody was holding on to the bumper. And Mom said, I told you these spirits, I told you. So a lot of little things happened on the way. I'd never been scared of things like that, but evidently Mom was. And she swore to God she's not going to the cemetery with me anymore. So, but anyway, we did a lot of traveling to courthouses. I've been to almost everywhere I'm telling you about where these people came from. I personally, once I identified, I went to the courthouse. So I went to Fauquier County, was in Winchester, I was in Prince William County. Of course, I live in Stafford, so that was no problem. I went to Petersburg, I was in Charles County, I was in St. Mary's, PG, so all over. Some of the descendants thought I was their personal genealogist, so they would ask me, please, please, can you find a little bit more, please, please, please. And so I went a little bit beyond what I was supposed to do. When I got ready to do the book, I wanted to interject what I consider the spoken word. I wanted people to feel what I felt when I was reading about the people. So in most of the chapters, I opened up with the spoken word, and it was all those articles I read and what was going on. This one, I'm gonna read this because it's short. Call our name. We lie here in these grounds waiting to hear our names, yet we not heard from you, our descendants. We are waiting to hear from you. We have been here for more than 150 years. We died so that you will be free. We would like to hear your voices and see your faces. We would like to learn about your lives and what you have become. We do not want to be forgotten like untended grass on an abandoned piece of land. We do not want to wither away with the passing of time, only to be thought of when another one of us is rediscovered. We want to hear our descendants' voices. We have a lot of history that you can learn from. And it goes on. Thank you.
Yes, you mentioned the Quander family,
Mm-hmm.
a very famous family with Alfred Street Baptist Church, and a linkage back to George Washington.
Yes.
But you mentioned in the context of a manifest on a Franklin Armfield
Yes.
ship. But yet, was that just one member? I mean, do you have any sense of what happened to that Quander, where they ended up?
That was 30 years ago, so it was not part of this project. And I was just going through, when I was 31 years old, that's when I found out about the slave pen. I was born and raised in Alexandria. None of my African-American teachers talked about it. I did not know about the slave issue, but when I found out, whoa, 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 I went in complete research mode, anything, everything. So I was at the National Archives. I worked in DC at VA on Vermont Street, 8 in Vermont, if you know where that is. The NARA will stay open 3 days a week up until 9, and that's where you will find me. So when I get off from work, I go there. And I stayed there, and we're talking about years of doing this. And so I was going through the manifest, I was looking at these names. Nothing made sense because I did not know what I know today. And I saw Quander, and that stuck with me. And then I knew something about the Quanders, and, but I never pursued it to where to find out. And I think it was like I think it was when Armfield and Franklin owned that, so that had to have been between 1820 something to 1830 something. So chances are they probably lost their identity as far as the Quander name. If you look at if she went down as a slave.
Some of those manifest also, usually it was just a first name.
Yeah, but some of them, especially Armfield, some of them gave them last names and let them have last names. Now, they probably were stripped of that when they got to where they were going. You see, so they might have lost their identity. DNA now maybe can reconnect them, you know. So. Yes.
I'm sure we've all seen the news recently about the seminary, the Virginia Theological Seminary, putting out their call for reparations and their endowment that they're going to try to make amends for their relationship with slavery. And I think I heard from Krista that maybe they had reached out to you or that there's something going on there. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that, and what do you think they're going to find as far as the descendants of folks who were connected to the seminary?
Okay, for me, if somebody said reparations, I don't want the money. I just want people to open up the records, because that's one of the most difficult things. Many families who had slaves still have those records in their house. They have not turned them over, to depositories. So to me, reparations will mean different from other people who might want to go for the money. I want to go for the records. Okay, so I don't know how they're going to have it. I do know that I talked to Christopher Pope when we were up there doing a visit with the descendants, and he said, I'll be reaching out to you once we're ready. I'm assuming, if we're looking at Georgetown, are you familiar with Georgetown? Okay. Georgetown, what they did to find the descendants, I think they're offering them like tuition, their descendants to come to the university. Based on Christopher was saying, they're not too sure what they're going to do, but they know they're going to be doing a lot of presentations on the topic and stuff like that. How I will approach that, I'm very familiar with the families that are up there and that were in seminary. But based on what I can tell, he said they tend to rent a lot of, during the time they rented a lot of slaves. Now, what I do know in working on Alexandria records, if you look at the 1860 slave schedule, if you're familiar with the census, they have an 1860 slave schedule. Alexandria had at least about 50% of the African Americans that were here as slaves, they were hired to them. And I believe they were I got one case that I documented. That's the Brent family that connect to the Freedman Cemetery. It was a Dr. Brent that came here from Fauquier County, and he brought some slaves with him. Time the Civil War broke out, they were considered free. Free as long as they stayed within the Union. When the Civil War ended, they leave and go back to Fauquier County. They lost a son named John. Well, then when they had another son, they named him John. That John comes to Alexandria in the 1890s. It was through that John I was able to connect back. And this year, a descendant, I think I posted something, saw that, and he contacted me because his family stayed. His relative was John's sibling. They didn't come, but John was the only one in his family that came back to Alexandria, and he connected to the descendant that I located here, and he came to the Freedman Cemetery. So I'm not too sure, what they're going to do with the information. They hire somebody to do the research. I can find the descendants. It might, one thing, they would give me the names. And they'll give me the names, and if they hired them from the plantation, they should be able to give me that information too. So that part is done now for me to bring it forward. So I call it reverse genealogy. I'm in the past working towards the future.
Any other questions for Char? All right.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. You're welcome.
Any one-on-one questions? Oh my gosh.